It is the dead of night in a palace in Korea, almost 600 years ago, and the most powerful man in the country is sitting alone at a low desk by the light of a single oil lamp. He is not young, and he is not well. His eyes, by the records, are failing him. And in his hand is a brush, and on the paper in front of him is something that has never existed before anywhere in the world. He is drawing letters, not the thousands of intricate Chinese characters that every educated person in his kingdom has spent a lifetime learning. Something new, a handful of small, simple, almost childlike shapes, an entire alphabet that he is building from nothing. You know this man, even if you do not know that you know him. He is King Sejong, remembered ever since as Sejong the Great, the face on the Korean 10,000 won note, the king who gave his people their writing. But the thing he is doing at that desk is one of the strangest acts any ruler has ever performed. Because writing in his world was power. To read and write was the single most jealously guarded privilege of the ruling class, the thing that separated the lord from the farmer. And Sejong was about to take that privilege and simply give it away to everyone, to the poorest and the lowest people in his kingdom, by making an alphabet so easy that his own scholars would admit a clever person could learn it in a single morning, and a slow one in 10 days. And he was doing it knowing what it would cost him. He knew that the most powerful scholars in his court, the very men his government leaned on, would be horrified, and that they would tell him to his face that what he was making would drag Korea down to the level of barbarians. So this is not a hymn to a great and gentle king, the story everyone already knows. It is the story of a question, and it is a genuinely strange one. Why would the most powerful man in Korea take the one thing that gave his own class its power and give it away to people who could never possibly repay him, against the fury of his own court? What did he see that they did not? And what did it cost him, and the letters he made in the dark? To answer that, we have to start not with the king, but with the silence he was trying to break. To understand what Sejong did, you have to understand what writing meant in Korea in the early 1400s. And the simplest way to say it is this. For almost everyone in the country, writing did not exist. Korea at this time wrote with Chinese characters, the same characters used across much of East Asia. And Chinese characters are magnificent, and they are merciless. There are thousands of them. Each one is a separate symbol that has to be memorized. And to read and write even at a basic level, you needed years of schooling, a tutor, the leisure to study, and books, all of which meant one thing: money. The result was a society split cleanly in two by a line drawn through the written word. On one side stood the Yangban, the scholar officials and the aristocracy, who spent their childhoods mastering the characters and who ran the entire country through them. The laws, the records, the histories, the examinations, the endless paperwork of a Confucian state. And on the other side stood everyone else, the overwhelming majority, the farmers and the craftsmen and the servants and almost all of the women, who could not read a single official word. And that divide was not an abstraction. It meant that a farmer brought before a magistrate could not read the charge against him. It meant that a person who had been wronged could not write down their own complaint, but had to rely on someone else to do it for them, and to do it honestly. It meant that a debt or a contract could be written over your head in characters you would never be able to check. And at the very bottom of it, it meant that an ordinary Korean could not write down their own name. They signed, when they had to sign at all, by pressing an inked fingertip onto the paper, a silent mark standing in for a person who had no way to speak on the page. This was simply how the world was, and almost no one in power thought of it as a problem to be solved, because the people it silenced were not the people who counted. And that is what makes the rest of this so strange. The man who decided that it was a problem and that he personally was going to fix it was not one of the silenced at all. He was the most powerful man in the entire kingdom. So who was he? King Sejong was the fourth king of the Joseon dynasty, and he came to the throne in 1418, in his early 20s, in a way he was never supposed to. He was a third son, not the heir, and by the ordinary rules the crown should never have reached him. But his eldest brother was set aside, and the throne came to Sejong instead. And almost at once, it became clear that something unusual had happened to the kingdom. Because Sejong was, above everything else, a reader. The stories told about his youth, polished as such stories always are, describe a boy so addicted to books that his father is said to have taken them away to make him rest. And the boy is said to have hunted down the stray pages they had missed and read those instead. What is certain is that he became a king who governed by study. He gathered the sharpest young minds in the country into an institution he built into the engine of his reign, the Hall of Worthies, a royal academy whose scholars were set to research everything: history, music, law, astronomy, farming, medicine, and to turn that knowledge into the practical business of running a state. Under Sejong, that single reign produced an astonishing burst of invention in science, in the calendar, in agriculture, in the measurement of the heavens. He genuinely believed that knowledge was the proper work of a ruler, and he was also, increasingly, a sick man. The records of his reign return again and again to his ailments, a long list of illnesses that worsened as he aged, and above all, to his eyes, which by his own account were failing, so that toward the end he could barely see. Hold those two things together, because they are the heart of it. Here was a king who lived by reading and the written word, and who could feel his own ability to read slipping away from him. A man who understood, better than any farmer ever could, exactly what it was to lose access to the page. It is impossible to climb inside another person's reasons, and we should be wary of tidy explanations. But it is not hard to see how a scholar king, losing his own sight, might come to think, with a particular and personal force, about all the people in his kingdom who had never been able to read at all. The question was no longer whether the silence was a problem. The question was how on earth you could possibly fix it. And here we reach the part that even now, 6 centuries later, is genuinely astonishing. Because Sejong did not solve the problem the easy way. The easy way, the way it had been tried before, was to borrow a handful of Chinese characters and use them to spell out Korean sounds. A clumsy patch that was still far too hard for ordinary people. Sejong threw that away. What he set out to do instead was to invent, from the ground up, a completely new alphabet, designed on purpose to be as simple and as logical as a writing system could possibly be. And the design he arrived at is the reason linguists today talk about Hangul the way they do. Most alphabets in the world are accidents. They drifted into being over centuries, their letters wandering into shapes that have nothing to do with the sounds they stand for. Hangul was designed, and it was designed around the human body. By the standard account, Sejong led this design himself, with the scholars of the Hall of Worthies helping to test and explain it, though there is a long scholarly debate about exactly how much was his own hand. And a popular modern claim, dramatized on screen, that a Buddhist monk was the real inventor, which most historians do not accept. But however much help he had, what came out of that work was extraordinary. The consonants were shaped to picture the mouth itself in the act of speaking. The letter for the K sound is a little drawing of the back of the tongue rising to block the throat. The letter for the N sound shows the tip of the tongue touching the ridge behind the teeth. The letter for the M sound is a simple square, the shape of the closed lips that make it. The basic consonants are tiny diagrams of your own mouth. And the vowels were built from just 3 strokes that carried for Sejong scholars an entire view of the cosmos. A single dot for heaven, a flat horizontal line for the earth, and an upright vertical line for the human beings standing between them, combined and recombined into every vowel the language needed. A whole writing system, generated from a small set of rational pieces. At the end of the year 1443, by the old lunar calendar, the king announced that it was finished. 28 letters, an entire alphabet, ready to be handed to a nation. And that, he must have thought, was the hard part finished. In fact, the hardest part of the whole story was only just about to begin. The blow came in 1444, and it came from the people Sejong trusted most. Early that year, a group of senior scholars from his own beloved Hall of Worthies, led by a respected official named Chui Manri, submitted a formal written protest to the king, an argument against the new alphabet, laid out point by point. And it is worth being fair to them, because they were not fools, and they were not, in their own eyes, villains. They were the most learned men in the country, defending the whole civilization they belonged to. Their argument ran something like this. Korea, they said, had always been a proud member of the civilized world, and the mark of that world, the thing that separated it from the barbarians, was the shared written language of China, the characters that carried all of philosophy and history and law. To turn away from those characters and invent a separate, homegrown script was exactly what the barbarians did. The Mongols and the Jurchen and the peoples beyond the frontier, each with their own crude letters. To follow them was to announce that Korea was leaving the civilized world behind and choosing to become small and provincial and alone. The new script, they argued, was vulgar. It was beneath the dignity of a serious state, and it had been rushed through without proper consultation. Underneath the high principle, of course, sat a harder truth they did not say aloud. A writing system that anyone could learn in a week was a direct threat to a class whose entire power rested on being the only ones who could read. Sejong's reply, which survives, was sharp. He challenged them on their own ground and pressed them on the weak points in their reasoning. And when the argument grew heated, the studious, gentle king, remembered ever after on the banknote, did something that still surprises people. He had several of his most respected scholars arrested and held overnight, over an alphabet. But the deeper point is what the protest revealed. The gift Sejong had made was not going to be met with gratitude. It was going to be resisted, quietly and for a very long time, by the people who had the most to lose. And in the short run, it was not the king, but his scholars who carried the day. In 1446, 2 years after the protest, Sejong went ahead anyway and formally gave the alphabet to his kingdom, in a document whose very name said what he meant by it. He called it the Hunmin Jeongeum, which means the correct sounds for the instruction of the people. Not for the scholars, for the people. And then the strangest chapter of the whole story began, which is that for the next 400 years, almost nothing happened. The new script worked exactly as Sejong had promised. It was easy, it was logical, and ordinary people who met it really could learn it in days. But the men who ran the country simply refused to use it. Officialdom went on conducting all of its serious business. The laws, the records, the examinations, the literature that was held to matter, in Chinese characters, exactly as before. And the king's elegant alphabet was pushed out to the margins of national life and left there. It picked up a dismissive nickname, Unmoon, the vulgar script, the writing you reached for when you were not doing anything important. It became, above all, the script of the people the elite did not count. Women, shut out of the classical education, wrote their letters and kept their records and read and wrote popular stories in it. Commoners used it for the small business of ordinary life. For 4 centuries it survived, not because it was honored, but because it was useful, carried quietly by exactly the people Sejong had made it for, while the powerful looked down on it. And at one point, a furious king even banned it outright. And then, slowly, in the upheavals of the modern era, as Korea was dragged into the modern world and its old order came apart, reformers went back and rediscovered what Sejong had actually built. They gave the script a new and proud name, Hangul, and they began to argue that this discarded vulgar writing was in truth a national treasure, one of the most rational and most democratic alphabets ever made. In the 20th century, Hangul became at last what Sejong had built it to be, the everyday writing of an entire people, the script of their newspapers and their poems and their laws and their children's first written words. The gift had taken 400 years to be received, and the man who made it had been gone for almost all of them. So, we come back, in the end, to the king at the desk, his eyes failing, drawing his small new letters one at a time in the lamplight. And we can finally try to answer the question we began with. Why would the most powerful man in Korea give away the one thing that gave his own class its power to people who could never repay him, against the will of his entire court? The honest answer seems to be the simplest one. He did it because he could see them. A king who governed by reading, and who was losing his own sight, looked at the millions of his people who had never been able to read a single word, and instead of accepting that as the natural order of things, the way every powerful person around him did, he decided that it was wrong, that he had the means to change it, and that the cost to himself did not matter enough to stop him. The real Sejong is not the serene golden face of the banknote. He is a sick, stubborn, half-blind king who took the most guarded privilege of his age and handed it down to the poorest people in his kingdom, and was told by his own scholars that he was disgracing his country, and did it anyway, and then died without ever seeing his gift received. He opened a door in the dark for people he would never meet, and it took the world 400 years to walk through it. Every Korean child who writes their own name today writes it through the door that he opened.